Okay, got it. Okay, my name is Lucia Prodella, and I'm one of the conveners of the Contemporary Marxism Working Group at King's College, but also collaborating with the colleagues in other universities. I would like to welcome everyone to this meeting today to discuss Ukraine from the perspective of the Global South and anti-imperialism. And I just want to start by expressing our solidarity to the Palestinian people facing the genocidal violence of the Israeli state. And also, since this is mainly hosted by King's College London, I would like to express our condolences to the family of Dr. Maizara Arayes, who is the next student at King's College, who studied women and children's health. And sorry, can you please mute yourself? Thanks. And 2 days ago was killed by an Israeli airstrike and spent more than 30 hours under the rubble. And in the end, he died. While he was under the rubble, his friends actually asked for help, including to King's College London, to demand a ceasefire, end of the occupation, and to enable a rescue operation for the 3,000 Palestinians who are currently under the rubble. And the college ignored this request for help, and so far has ignored the death of this student. So tomorrow students are going to walk out in the Strand at 12:30. So if you're around and you want to join them, you're very welcome to join this student walkout in the Strand. I think that this kind of provides some context to today's seminar, in which we want to address the question of the Russia-Ukrainian war from the perspective of the Global South, and therefore from a global perspective. On the one side, clearly the two wars are connected, and Israel's war against the Palestinians and the unconditional support that the West has provided to Israel has drawn away the West's attention towards the war in Ukraine, a war that in any case is turning into a stalemate that could favor Russia in the long run. On the other side, the West's unconditional support for Israel and the kind of clear double standards has also poisoned Western efforts to build a consensus in the Global South. And it's quite a famous Financial Times article. A G7 senior official said what the West has definitely lost the battle in the South to build consensus towards Ukraine, which is one of the topics that we will discuss this evening. And so I think one of the questions that we wanted to discuss even before this current situation is what lies at the roots of these double standards, and how to address the war in Ukraine from a left-wing and anti-imperialist perspective. And so we are actually very happy about the panel we have this evening, because it's an international panel and with very good speakers, and we hope it will be also a very good discussion. So our first speaker is Olena Lyubchenko, who is a PhD candidate in political sciences at York University in Canada, and will discuss the competitive interests that lie behind the Russian and Western justifications of the war. Secondly, Chelsea Nguyen, who was a UN rapporteur in Indonesia and Thailand, will then explore Ukraine's civilizational vision for its national survival from the perspective of its wartime diplomacy in the Global South, looking in particular at Vietnam and Indonesia. And finally, Trevor Ngwame, who is the director of the Center for Sociological Research and Practice at the University of Johannesburg, will offer a perspective from South Africa that, as you know, has recently hosted the BRICS meeting, and also where the left forces and the government have actually sided with Russia. And Trevor will discuss whether this reflects a proper anti-imperialist perspective or whether the left should adopt a completely different stance towards this war. Okay, so this is a brief introduction. So each speaker has 15 minutes. Our first speaker is Olena. We'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left. And yes, the only thing, we welcome questions at the end. If you want to write down briefly in the chat your name, if you want to sign up for asking a question, and if you want to write down what you're going to ask, that's very welcome. I think it's clear we welcome polite and comradely discussion, and we won't tolerate any abusive language in the second part during the Q&A. Okay, thanks so much. Olena, you go first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. When I was invited, and thank you, Lucia Pradella, and thank you to you, Lucia, and to the organizers of the seminar for inviting me. When I was invited to speak about the war in Ukraine from an anti-imperialist perspective here, we did not yet have these events in Gaza, where the state of Israel is conducting a genocide against people of Palestine, Palestinians. So we have heard about genocide in Ukraine from Western and Ukrainian sources, but when it came to people in Gaza, you know, politicians, students, organizers have been silenced. But let me say just a few empirical facts. So every day in Gaza, according to the UN, 136 kids are killed. That is over 4,130 days. And in Ukraine, it was about 0.7 kids. That is about 510, like per day, and then 510 in about 2 years. And of course, we mourn all kids. However, the Western elites and the Ukrainian and post-Soviet ruling classes remind us that for them, Palestine is not Ukraine. Somehow, both Ukraine and Israel were declared the kind of the civilized party in the conflicts, exercising their right to defend themselves on the same side. Many journalists, and as Lucia pointed out already at the beginning in the introduction, many journalists have pointed out the double standards in the treatment of Ukrainians and Palestinians. But what I want to argue today is that this is not double standards. I suggest that we cannot not see Ukraine, or we cannot not unsee Ukraine in light of Palestine, because it is not double standards, because both cases are part of one logic. And the war in Ukraine has emboldened this logic. It is kind of a revival of the legitimacy of the so-called rules-based order, one that is based on and rooted in, you know, absence of rules for some, exception of or exemption from rules for some, deeply rooted in colonial racial capitalism. So today I will speak about how this logic has been manifested in Ukraine. And if I have time, I will come back to what I call, or what I'm trying to think about, the peace versus liberation dilemma, to suggest that both the dispossessed working class people of post-Soviet Ukraine and of post-Soviet Georgia and of post-Soviet Armenia and Kyrgyzstan and so on, and Palestinians dispossessed, segregated, murdered by the state of Israel, want and deserve not just a ceasefire, a peace that is only based on status quo or return back to normal. I don't know for Ukraine what this normal is, the 1990s normal, which was not normal at all, right? Peace indeed sounds like a white man's kind of word, right? But liberation, so not just peace, ceasefire, but liberation from the very structures of dispossession in the first place. And for Ukraine, we need to go back to at least the 1990s, post-Soviet collapse and primitive accumulation, the process of primitive accumulation. So the war in Ukraine has revived this kind of civilized rules-based order logic, right, that we thought was already criticized away by anti-colonial scholars, by anti-colonial and anti-capitalist movements too, in the post-World War II period. But in Ukraine, this revival, this is new, this rules-based order has become associated with Ukrainian self-determination, decolonization from Russia and from the Soviet past, and de-communization. The kind of happy marriage within modernization theory, the rules-based democratic order and capitalism, together now couched in Ukraine's self-determination and the logic and the language of decolonization. In March, like in February 2022, in March, right, we heard things like no country should invade its neighbor in the 21st century, right? This kind of became such a common sense discourse. And roughly a week after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US Department of Justice launched a task force dedicated to enforcing US sanctions against Russian capital. And this task force was called Klepto Capture. It's a good name. Of course, calls by US progressives to seize all, including American oligarchs' wealth and redistribute it to the people, went unanswered because CNN declared that, you know, Russia's oligarchs are different from other billionaires, certainly different from US billionaires who follow rules-based world order. Ukraine's sovereignty and self-determination, both understood by local elites and, you know, Western elites have become bound up with incorporation into Fortress Europe, and I would argue the making, and I have argued this before, the making of the Ukrainian nation as white and European. But the concept of self-determination, really its origins in the internationalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial revolutionary left, it's instrumentalized in this way today, right? In the use of Western and Ukrainian elites, and also Russian elites, the history of local internationalism, communism, anti-fascism is kind of separated from self-determination through these Eurocentric maneuvers. Ironically, in this sense, this kind of utilization is not far from Putin's own attacks on Ukraine's self-determination, which is kind of bound up with the Leninist, right, principles of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. So what we need today is to kind of take back what is originally ours, the anti-colonialism belonging with anti-capitalist politics, for the analysis of the post-Soviet condition and the position of working class people from post-Soviet countries in relation to Europe as a political and economic project and the promises of its white citizenship. So the idea of Ukraine's return to Europe based on this self-determination obfuscates really the processes in the 90s, but also how Europe's own reproduction is underpinned by the very dispossessive economic reforms in post-Soviet countries and in Eastern Europe and the global South simultaneously. And it is shaped by racialized citizenship and gendered violence. Scholarship on Eastern Europe, which attends to race, class, and imperialism, shows how the neoliberal reforms that are kind of part of a never-ending transition path toward the democratic capitalist European future and rules-based order. Finally, we're going to be ruled by rules, you know, and not corruption, you know, this whole thing. In fact, it's a vision of a, you know, return to Europe and European values historically and contemporarily couched in racial terms too, right? And rooted in the 90s restructuring. In Ukraine, as in other post-Soviet Eastern European countries, neoliberalism arrived in the form of shock therapy reforms aimed at transforming the centralized socialist economy towards market imperative, restructuring the relationship between production and social reproduction. And of course, scholars in Ukraine as well as elsewhere, they have called this process, using Marx's Capital Volume 1, have called this process primitive accumulation, right? This kind of dispossession in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine in particular, in my case, generated a disciplined workforce, right, at home, and a reserve army of precarious, usually gendered migrant labor headed for the EU, right at the same time as healthcare, care in general was becoming more and more privatized, marketized in Western Europe. So as post-Soviet Ukraine's industrialized economy, public infrastructure, and skilled labor force underwent a period of primitive accumulation, right? Ukrainian mothers and grandmothers began working, migrating as domestic workers and so on, doing the social reproductive work previously borne by the Western white women, not cheap white. And the existing colonial kind of colonial imaginaries place post-Soviet Ukraine and among other post-socialist states and post-Soviet states in particular on a kind of trajectory of to progress. So a transition from this Soviet man or Homo Sovieticus to civilized European white subject, right? And economically, this transition takes the shape of free market neoliberal reforms at home, which are push factors, as I said, right, for labor migration to the West. And racializing Eastern Europeans as kind of cheap white or peripherally white fuels Western economic gains by intensifying labor competition and further devaluing workers from the global South as the racialized other. But this hierarchy in relation to whiteness is very important to capture. And I think we, in scholarship on Ukraine now in particular, after the invasion, I think we should really move in this direction. So just a week after Russia's invasion, in a journal called American Purpose, it's an online publication, Francis Fukuyama wrote that a Russian defeat will make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. The spirit of 1989 will live on thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians, a bunch, end quote. Yeah, so just to show how much this decolonization and this fight for freedom and decommunization, the spirit of 1989, are really wedded together. In 2020, right, 2 years before the invasion, the number of Ukrainian workers living abroad was estimated at between 2.2 to 2.7 million, right? That's quite a bit. It's about 16% of total employment in the country. And before the recent invasion, again, Ukraine was the largest recipient of remittances in Europe and Central Asia. It's a lot, according to the new data from National Bank, in 2021, remittance flows to Ukraine surpassed 19 billion. Remittances contributed to about 50 to 60% of the recipient household budget. So really this dependence on remittances by, cheap workers in Europe, in the West, that are sending back money to sustain, to reproduce socially their families at home, right? Because the state isn't doing that. But today, as a result of the war, right, the material destruction, Ukraine is really facing a crisis in terms of infrastructure. So 8 million people, mostly women, now more than that probably, have left the country. People are really unemployed. The reconstruction and recovery costs have grown to over $400 billion US. So many people pushed into poverty and so on. And of course, we have damage of the Soviet era public infrastructure, right? Its own process of de-communization, really, by the Putin regime. So the war and its military industrial profits are kind of socialized by the former Soviet infrastructure, and in its own right, a certain a certain both decommunization, but also a certain process of primitive accumulation, whether we're talking about schools or hospitals or water pipes or kindergartens, right? It's being expropriated in Ukraine in real time. But despite this alarming data, right, it's horrible, which points to the need to increase social protections, to strengthen labor protections and so on, right? During this kind of existential threat for the people, the Ukrainian state instituted even harsher neoliberal reforms, many of which were kind of in the making prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And these domestic reforms, often pushed by the IMF, to which I will turn in a second, they are kind of a method of decommunization of Ukraine in their own right? So going to the IMF loan, in March of this year, the Zelensky government reached a loan agreement with the IMF, and it's huge. It's $15.6 billion US, 4-year financing package, which ties the government to an agenda of cutting back on social expenditures, of course, right away. And as a result, there will be substantial changes to the pension and social safety net programs. So in the best of...
You have 3 minutes, sorry.
That's sure. And in the best of decommunizing fashions, there's kind of a move away from Soviet status related benefits towards like means tested, right? It's really and private insurance. Let me skip a little bit. Yes, so I'm almost at the end. So for instance, whereas before single mothers, veterans, people with disabilities, they would have received financial assistance based on status. Now it's means tested, right? And while describing these, what are seen Europeanizing, decommunizing reforms, Ukraine's Minister of Social Policy has recently said something like, we want our people to stop living with the feeling that someone owes them something. Want to give everyone a fishing rod that will help them catch fish to gain economic independence and with it a decent life. The idea that the state is responsible for social reproduction, of care of its citizens, is really being eroded. It's kind of, this is the part of decommunizing and Europeanizing as one logic. Right? So yeah, I just want to say that Ukraine has really become a laboratory in neoliberal innovation and constructed, and of course, who's losing in this fight? Who's losing in this new Ukraine, constructed by the Ukrainian state and liberal elites and welcomed in the West, right? This idea of self-determination as a return to Europe is really, really entangled in historically unequal, gendered, racialized relations of global capitalism. The already impoverished population of Ukraine, lacking resources in the precarious public sector, healthcare, education, so on, right? It's subsidizing also this war effort with household labor, women especially women in eastern and southern Ukraine that is hit hardest. So yeah, we must ask a question: what is the character of Ukraine's self-determination, and whom does Ukraine represent and include, right? What is the future political project? Will resistance to Russian imperialism translate into building solidarities with anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist struggles and movements in the global South, including Palestine, right? And today, unfortunately, it does not look that way. This would require falling out of delusions about Europe, where Ukrainian feminized labor goes only to reproduce this Europe. This would require really a critique of Eurocentrism from an anti-capitalist perspective. So I want to close my presentation by saying free Palestine and victory to the working class people and the mothers and grandmothers of post-Soviet Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Olena. Well, I think this links up very well with the next speaker, so Chelsea Nguyen, who is going to talk about Ukraine's wartime diplomacy in the global South. Chelsea, you have some slides, so I see some people clapping, by the way. It's a bit silent on Zoom, but okay, Chelsea, do you want to share your screen? You should be able to share your screen. Okay. Thank you. And I'll tell you, I forgot, but this time I'll tell you when you have 5 minutes. Okay. Sorry, we can't see your slides and you're still muted, so I'm asking you to unmute.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. I'm just gonna. Um, can you see my screen now?
No.
Okay, because okay, sorry. Share screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, the problem is that when I put full screen on the PowerPoint, I can't see my manuscript. So is it okay? I put it this way.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for your invitation to speak today. I'll continue Olena's points. When I was invited for this seminar, I had already since last year witnessed how Indonesian and Ukrainian diplomats were quarreling with each other about competing solidarities for Israeli and Palestinian civilians. Because before this year, last year was already the worst year in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of casualties. Okay, I'll just start. Okay, as the Russia-Ukrainian war enters its second year, 2023 has been a historic year in terms of how the global South has never been as passionately evoked in a manner of grieving protest as much as exuberant confidence among its individual members since the demise of the last Global South project along socialist, nationalist, and non-aligned lines by the early 1980s. At the G20 summits held in Indonesia in 2022 and in India this year, the host leaders proclaimed themselves as the voice of the Global South and made sure that the summit's agendas were heavily steered towards the broadly shared concerns of the Global South, ranging from inadequate deliveries of climate finance commitments to debt structurings and reliefs. During India's G20 hostship, the centrality of the Global South was pushed forward so ferociously to the extent that Ukraine was not only prevented from attending the summit, but whose ongoing endurance of a Russian invasion was also diluted by reference in the joint leaders' declaration. Brazil, as the host country of the G20 summit next year, have under President Lula railed against the pressure from the West for his country to unequivocally support Ukraine. What does this historic moment entail for Ukraine and the notion of the Global South as such? In this occasion, I would like to stimulate a discussion on the discontents of Ukraine's civilizational political visions for its national survival and post-war independence from the lenses of its wartime diplomacy in the Global South. I will have a special attention to Asia, in particular countries as Indonesia and Vietnam, with overall deep historical bonds with the former Soviet Union. My main argument is that Ukraine's civilizational approach to wartime diplomacy has been self-constraining and is bound to be self-defeating in the long term when it comes to achieving a more broader appeal and a sense of shared struggle among governments and peoples across the global South. Civilizational portrayals of a war of liberation have featured heavily in Ukraine's wartime diplomacy by the highest levels of its government, intelligentsia, and public. In marking the first-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, President Volodymyr Zelensky held a speech at the European Parliament where he declared Russia to be the biggest anti-European force of the modern world. By European, he meant its ostensibly way of life steeped in rules, values, equality, and fairness, and a place where Ukraine is firmly at home. Subsequently, in a self-congratulatory judgment of Ukraine's wartime diplomacy, an advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Yuna Potomkina, concluded that Ukraine has been highly successful at getting across the message that Russia's invasion is a clash of civilizations with global implications. However, by expanding beyond Ukraine's transatlantic rearguards with an outlook of how these might be interpreted across the diverse audiences of the global South, these assessments may appear prematurely optimistic. When wars, conflicts, and struggles are presently taking place in other parts of the world, from Myanmar to Palestine, they are not for an exclusively new European future as such, but for a more universally shared one, an equal humanity of dignity, worth, and protection as promised by the UN Charter and the international laws as the most basic litmus test for such a possible future. As such, civilizational and therefore exclusionary pretensions about what kind of a national and global future one is fighting for becomes fundamentally problematic. Ukraine's patterns must also be situated as part of a broader trend of civilizational international politics in recent times. Until recently, I had been reluctant to use the all-encompassing term the Global South, as it had since the early 1980s degenerated into a term without much cohesively shared political meaning, organizational front, and alternative systemic visions for a more equal and just world order. Nevertheless, the notion of the Global South as a territorial, relational, structural, and political construct can still offer broad, important insights about a widespread desire among many countries with a history of colonial domination to resist the existing unequal distribution of power in the global system. In Indonesia, many fondly remembers how the Soviet Union, in fact the UN mission of the Ukraine Socialist Republic, raised the question of Indonesian independence at the UN Security Council in 1946, as the Dutch were waging a brutal war of recolonizing Indonesia. This relationship had reached a peak between 1955 and 64, at a time of reverberating decolonial euphoria as Indonesia's prestige grew across the Global South or the non-aligned Third World following the Bandung Conference in 1955 and its complete victory over the Dutch by 1962 with Soviet military assistance. On March 2nd and 24th, 2022, Indonesia voted in support of the two UN General Assembly resolutions that condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine and called for the withdrawal of Russian troops out of Ukraine's internationally recognized territories. As the chair of the G20 summit in 2022, Indonesia's president, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, became the first statesman from the Global South to having visited wartime Ukraine. Moreover, Ukraine was also allowed to present its 10-point peace plan for the first time to the world at the summit. Nevertheless, public sentiments have been predominantly marked by an overall sympathy for Russia and reluctance towards Ukraine. In pitching up support, the Ukrainian ambassador to Indonesia invoked deeply sensitive and divided local memories of Indonesia's bloody past of anti-communism. He praised the massacre of 500,000 to 1 million people across Indonesia between 1965 and 1966, which was among the 20th century's bloodiest massacres. In 2014, President Jokowi was elected partly by an electoral promise to courageously push forward national reconciliation for the many silenced victims of that massacre. At last, in January this year, the president formally extended the Indonesian state's deep regrets and acknowledgement that the massacres indeed took place. In August 2022, Indonesia condemned Israel's airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. This is well in accordance with Indonesia's remaining anti-colonial tradition of solidarity with Palestine, being among the few countries left in the world that still do not have formal diplomatic ties to Israel, while affirming to the two-state solution by the 1967 border. No other comparable international conflict have timelessly galvanized many Indonesians as much as the cause of Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Unprovokingly, Ukraine's ambassador was angered by Indonesia's condemnation of Israel, accusing Indonesia of not having sufficiently condemned Russia and demonstrated concern for Muslim kids in Ukraine. This, in spite of the fact that Ukraine's ambassador to Israel simultaneously expressed Ukraine's full support for Israel with no hints of any concern for Palestinian children. In other words, an absence of moralizing reciprocity of solidarity, even by the standards of the international laws. At issue is not Ukraine's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict per se, but rather the illusionary universality of the international laws and equal worth of civilian victims across different wars and spheres of civilization, between the just and the barbarian victims of war, with Europe as the epitome of such civilization. Unlike Indonesia, Vietnam abstained from both the UN General Assembly resolutions on Ukraine in March 22. In the early phases of the war, public sentiments were largely in support of Russia. Following the early successes of Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2022, public opinion have ever since been divided. Vietnam's statement to the UN General Assembly during the emergency session on Ukraine was widely interpreted as a veiled criticism of the Russian invasion. Meanwhile, Vietnam continues to affirm by Russia as a key ally and its opposition to unilateral sanctions against Russia and the expulsion of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Ukraine's alliance with the United States has also made it difficult for Vietnam to openly support its wartime cause. However, the war is also taking place at a time when Vietnam is herself enjoying all-time high ties with the US, the West, and its allies and partners elsewhere, reminiscent to many of the foreign policy patterns of the former Yugoslavia under Tito. More profoundly than in Indonesia, many Vietnamese people continue to hold deep-seated appreciation and cherishing memory of the Soviet Union. Unlike Ukraine, Russia's wartime diplomacy has been successful at pitching up and connecting with such local memories, though by a dishonest portrayal of the contemporary Russian state as the sole heir of the Soviet Union and its past contributions to various 20th century anti-colonial struggles in the Third World, including that of Vietnam. During the US invasion of Vietnam, thousands of military and technical advisors from the Soviet Union served on the ground in Vietnam, including many from Soviet Ukraine. Following Vietnam's military victory in 1975, it was largely the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc that helped a war-ravaged Vietnam fill its acute human capital gaps and train its modern state builders, as the country navigated through a 20-years-long harsh international sanctions regime and prolonged border wars in Cambodia and with China.
You have 5 minutes, sorry.
The assistance from Soviet Ukraine in alleviating unified Vietnam's many diplomatic, economic, and social crises by subsidized crops exports, food aid, maintenance of military hardware, and educational opportunities was indispensable. Most vividly to Vietnamese public memory, between 1979 and 1994, 11 Soviet experts, 3 of them Ukrainians, sacrificed during the construction of Southeast Asia's once largest hydropower plant until 2012, the Hoa Binh Dam, or in English, Peace Dam. To many Vietnamese people who are simultaneously sympathetic to Ukraine and fond of the historical Soviet Union, especially among the older generations, the current war is seen as one between two formerly socialist and brotherly nations of Vietnam and regarded with tremendous poignant sadness. Comparisons between wartime Ukraine and Vietnam have been made, in which some have argued that Ukraine is the Vietnam of the 21st century. But in terms of political and ideological nature of Vietnam and Ukraine, which translates into the distinct approaches to wartime diplomacy for rallying international support, they are quite different. Throughout the 20th century Cold War, Vietnam became the armed global battlefield between the capitalist and communist worlds. For Vietnam, its wartime diplomacy was not about seeking a civilizational decolonization, void of the necessity of a social revolution at home in the pursuit of national liberation as a solution to modern questions such as colonialism and imperialism. It was about the universality of socialism, national liberation, civil rights, and solidarity movements that were simultaneously taking place across the world, especially in the French and American societies, and regarded as a shared struggle for Vietnam. Vietnam's wartime diplomacy and post-war political and economic developments offer as much as a lesson of success in rallying for international support, as much as a lesson of human tragedies in retrospect when ethnicism, narrow-minded nationalism, and circumscribed political and civic freedoms take the front seat. Vietnam shares the tragic predicament of 20th century historical communism, that of the question of democracy. The ideals and limitations of socialist internationalism unfolded in their most tragic and bloody manifestations in Vietnam. It has left an equally liberating and traumatic experience. The question of Ukraine's self-identification in the face of an emerging global South-oriented new world order is therefore timely imperative. The open-ended question is whether Ukraine will be able to realize the potentially universal and progressive relevance to the future of the world, rather than merely becoming part of Europe. It is a difficult question, as there are many different global souths emerging with competing political and economic visions and interests among their nation-states. However, the everyday suffering of ordinary citizens and victims in these societies, likely in the billions, should not be immorally disregarded in the name of power competitions and multipolarity. The imperative of moving beyond a civilizational understanding of itself, as well as the broader world, has been most bloodily reminded by the latest Israeli-Palestinian escalations. The unfolding hypocrisies of the West's contrasting responses have become ever more glaring and are now fueling popular rage across the world against a peripheralized humanity as seen by the unequal worth, dignity, and protection of civilian victims across different wars. Such is the perils of civilizationalism now unfolding at its most morally bankrupt manifestations by the collective West renunciations of the international laws and anything that is left of basic human decency and honesty. The collective West's wartime diplomacy in the global South to rally support against the Russian invasion have lost their moral impetus. As generations of Ukrainians and Palestinians, with their once youthful ideals, dreams, optimism, and hopes for life under suffocating occupations, are being wiped out as I speak, the dead no longer need to live through a callous world behind them. In their honor, we must reject the constraining logics of geopolitics and restore humanity in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And you can also find some of Chelsea's articles about this. For example, there is an article, What's Wrong with Ukraine's Wartime Diplomacy in the Global South, which was published on the Commons some time ago. Okay, our next speaker is Trevor. Trevor, are you there? I'm asking to unmute.
I'm here.
Hi. Hi, Trevor. I'll give you 15 minutes. Can you turn on your camera, please? Thanks so much.
I'm in a. Can I sit here a bit? Can I sit here a bit? Okay. Because we talk to some people. Okay. You'll see me in a minute. But thank you for having me. Yeah, what I want to talk about is what is happening in South Africa, especially how comrades are responding to the Ukraine war. So basically, there are three factors which affect the South African comrades on the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. But firstly, let me make it clear that we stand with the Ukraine working class, Ukraine people against this invasion. And then also, I want to echo the words of the previous speaker who talked about Palestine. We support the Palestinians as they get decimated in what amounts to a genocide by the forces of Zionism. So there are three things which affect the South African position, or at least of the comrades on the war. The first one is what I call nostalgia about the Soviet Union. So there is this belief that, you know, Russia was part of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union supported the struggle against apartheid, and therefore we should support Russia. Secondly, there is a third world nationalism. So third world nationalism is basically believing that all the states which were colonized before in Africa, Latin America, Asia must stand together, irrespective of what policies each state follows, individually follows. And then the third issue is that of the South African government's membership of BRICS. BRICS is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa bloc, which has been recently joined by 6 new countries: the UAE, Argentina, Ethiopia, Algeria, Iran. I think I'm missing one. So another main thing I want to talk about in relation to how South Africa is responding to this issue of the Ukraine war is the fact that BRICS, which I'll talk a bit more about, but just to make clear, in my opinion, is essentially a project of capitalist restoration. So it's also especially for China and Russia. So it is these two countries' geopolitical repositioning in the context of their respective policies of capitalist restoration. For South Africa, you know, I suppose, and other post-colonial states, specifically Ethiopia, Algeria, who are part of BRICS, I think it is a struggle for survival in a ruthless international capitalist order. Now, an important point about this is how, in fact, okay, yeah, now I'm sorry, I'm busy talking and trying to find the you know, the picture thing. I'm so sorry. I just don't want to let you down. Okay, I found it now, so I can go on, yeah, speak with freedom. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I talked about capitalist restoration, and now this capitalist restoration is happening in the context of a global capitalist crisis. So we all know that the world today is characterized by turmoil, uncertainty, instability, insecurity. And the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has contributed to this, has added. But in terms of the capitalist crisis, from 2008, during the global meltdown, also followed by COVID-19, we saw what I can call the crisis of neoliberalism, where neoliberal capitalist states were forced to intervene in order to save the banks and insurance corporations. Remember how Obama paid off AIG, JP Morgan, Stanley Morgan, and them. So this is a crisis of neoliberalism. And an aspect of this crisis is the rise of right-wing movements who are responding to the global crisis and now are checking globalization, calling for protectionism, against cosmopolitanism. We all know about Trump, you know, building his wall and also putting America first, making America great again. These are all responses to a rolling, intractable international crisis of capitalism, for which the ruling class the ruling classes have got no solution. The problem now is that each ruling class in their respective countries has to deal with economic crisis internally, with the dissatisfactions by the masses, where every people in the world, they take for granted that they must get water, electricity, housing, education. So there is now this shift away from the global economy towards more taking care of my own country. There is also geopolitical repositioning, where countries want to form alliances with stronger countries and abandon those countries who cannot help them. So BRICS comes within this context. And the first question, of course, about BRICS, which I'll soon relate to the war in the Ukraine, is what is it for? Why is South Africa joining, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now the other 6 new countries? So BRICS started as a loose, pragmatic trade bloc, almost focusing on the economic rather than the political, and slightly based on what I can call post-colonial sensibilities or sentiments, with China saying, I'm siding with all the countries which were oppressed and colonized. But in my own opinion, without being flippant, I think BRICS represents a huddling together of countries who are threatened by the USA's bully boy tactics. And this USA hegemony and bullying of other countries became worse after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the world almost became unipolar. So there is that strong need to create a counter-polar, something to push back against the USA. So, as I said, it's said loosely, but it's developing into a political bloc in the sense that these countries of BRICS, they want to create a bargaining lever against the power and dominance of what they call now Western capitalist countries. Some of these countries we can consider middle powers, or some we can call them emerging economies. Of course, among them is China and Russia, who maybe have got bigger ambitions to become world powers, to create a real power bloc which can dominate the world in the future. Now, recently, BRICS had a meeting in Sandton in Johannesburg, where the decision was taken to accept these 6 new countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina. But indeed, when we listen carefully, there was a lot of mixed messages. Third world nationalism, although they didn't talk about socialism, but they're almost saying BRICS is going to create a more equal world. But there was also a strong element of economic expediency in this jostling. For example, I imagine they want the UAE, Saudi Arabia, because of the oil. People are still trying to figure out why these 6 countries, because more than 50 countries actually applied to join BRICS. Yeah. Another thing about BRICS is that there seems to be a thinking, an imagined new world order must be created, a new geopolitical balance of power, more safe for the global south. And then all this, of course, is couched in anti-imperialist resistance to Western domination language. One specific project of the BRICS countries, of course, they've got a bank, the National, I can't remember, Development Bank. which is going to provide loans instead of the World Bank. There is also the dollarization, de-dollarization. So BRICS want to stop the dollar dominating the world and have trade taking place in other currencies. But BRICS admits that this is a very long-term project. Now, going back to the Ukraine, now with BRICS having all these mixed, sometimes
you have 3
unclear.
minutes, sorry.
3 minutes, okay. Yeah. With BRICS having all these mixed, sometimes unclear objectives, there was a gradualism, a slowness in building up BRICS. You know, many countries wanted to join. They said, okay, we'll look at it in our next summit. But Russia's invasion of the Ukraine disturbed this gradualism. In fact, it raised the stakes and almost forcing countries of BRICS and other countries, by the way, to take a side. Do you support Russia or the Ukraine? Of course, Putin, a member of BRICS, you must stand with me. Yeah. And then, of course, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine introduced a new element, the military agenda, you know, which is dangerously linked to possible nuclear war threats. So to conclude, therefore, South Africa has been vacillating where it stands. It doesn't want to denounce Russia, you know, the invasion, but at the same time, it doesn't want to support it. The USA accused South Africa of providing arms to Russia about a ship which docked in the Cape, but I think the USA was just forcing South Africa's hand. Last week, we had AGOA, which is a meeting of USA countries which have a special trade deal with the USA. The AGOA meeting took place in South Africa. This is in the context where South Africa its trade with the USA. So it's South Africa's chief trading partner is China, closely followed by the US. So it's almost South Africa is trying to balance things. So my last point is, as socialists, when we look at all these complications, the Ukraine war, our question is, what can ordinary workers do? How are ordinary workers affected? And then we see that the BRICS countries, there's a lot of repression of workers, repression of trade unions, gender-based oppressions, especially the new entrants, UAE, you know, Saudi Arabia, authoritarianism. So we don't want a BRICS or a project to counter Western imperialism, where workers are spectators. Marx said the working class is the revolutionary subject. So we want the workers to be in the forefront of creating a new world, of creating a new balance in the world geopolitics. So for that reason, we don't support BRICS. We stand with the Ukraine working class, you know, suffering under the bombs of Russia, and we support strongly. We are against the restoration of capitalism in Russia, in China, everywhere in the world. We are for creating an alternative anti-capitalist order, a socialist order. Thank you, and I'm sorry about the technical glitches. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I see there are some clapping signs and so on. So I guess this is an appreciation. So, Tavor, how long can you stay? Because I know that you need to leave a bit earlier.
Yeah, I can stay maybe 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there are questions for Trevor specifically, can you please raise your hand? Otherwise, I wrote down a few questions that I think maybe, and I will call others who ask to speak. Okay, I don't see anyone typing, but okay. So I think, there are some questions for all the speakers and some questions specifically for Olena. Well, I think one of the questions that has come up a few times, I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hands. This was about the question of how we intend, the question of Ukrainian agency and the fact that, even if the ruling class in Ukraine collaborates with the West, it doesn't mean that socialists shouldn't support Ukrainians' struggle for self-determination. Okay, so this was, I think, Doug and Anastasia who wrote comments about this. Then, so I don't know if, then there are a few questions specifically for Olena. Kyle, I know you need to leave. Do you want to ask your question if you're still here, Kyle Bailey?
Yeah, I'm still here. I need to put some headphones with a microphone in so you can actually hear. So I'm just doing that quickly.
We can hear you, Kyle.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, it was just a question for Olena about her earlier. Her point that she opened her talk with about what a single logic of imperialism might look like here, and maybe what role the principle of self-determination has in that. Because I mean, obviously it's kind of a double-edged sword. The US raised it in relation to Ukraine, especially, but then the whole issue has had to be put down very, very hard in relation to Palestine. So what might be the underlying logic that might unite these two seemingly opposed cases? Yes.
Okay, thanks so much, Kyle, and nice to meet you virtually. I will ask. Okay, so Jan Stout. So I will ask Alex to intervene next, and then I will call Jan so that Trevor can answer if he needs to go. And then I see there are other questions specifically about Ukraine or Cold War and anti-communism that we can discuss later. So Alex, do you want to go next?
Okay, I'll try and be quick. I think it's very important not to treat these two wars that are raging at the minute, Ukraine and Palestine, as two separate conflicts. And I agree completely with Olena that a single logic is involved. But if we want to understand that single logic, it has a number of different elements. And one very important element is the geopolitical. In other words, the global context is a process of inter-imperialist competition involving, crucially, the United States, China, with the EU and so on in its wake, China, and from the perspective of Washington, there's no conflict between their positions on these two questions. I just saw a tweet by Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and he said the G7 are united in supporting Ukraine and Israel and in defending the rules-based order. In other words, they see both conflicts as part of the struggle, essentially, to maintain US hegemony and the kind of international order that it's construct. To say that is deny any one agency. There are all sorts of different actors involved in this process. But from the perspective of, if you like, the high command in Washington. On the one hand, Ukraine is useful as a proxy in tying down and weakening Russia. They've been very explicit about this. Now we know that the CIA has been involved in reconstructing two intelligence services, the domestic one and the military intelligence in Ukraine, as far back as 2015. That doesn't mean those services or the Ukrainian state more generally are simply puppets of Washington, but it means that they have been instrumentalized. Similarly, the US has to prop up, whatever its reservations, Israel, because it's a very militarily strong ally in trying to maintain control over the Middle East. The problem is this widens the global fracture. You see, I think what Chelsea said of historical reasons why in Indonesia and Vietnam people are cheering about backing Ukraine is right, but it's also to do with the kind of current unilateral assertion of Western power. I think the most important reason why states are moving towards the BRICS and trying to join it, why there's been this remarkable expansion of the BRICS, is because of the way in which the US and the EU reacted to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia by seizing Russia's foreign reserves. And so all sorts of capitalist classes in the South, who in lots of ways would like to be chums with Washington, who implement neoliberal policies and so on and so forth, say, we want action on the kind of unilateral financial power of the West. So the issues aren't just military power, but also financial power and how they're interwoven in this global conflict and the terrible wars we're seeing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. Jen Stout, the next question, and then I'll ask Trevor and the others if they want, or maybe only Trevor, and then let's see. Jen?
Thank you. Yes, can you hear me?
We can, very well.
Good. I do have an actual question. I'd like to ask Trevor about, he talked about the Soviet nostalgia, the Soviet legacy, and this comes up obviously in so many countries around the world. And it is a big issue when so much of this war is to do with memory and history and contested memory, I think. For context, I'm a journalist. I've spent most of the last year and a half in Ukraine reporting, and I do long contextual reported features, often reflecting on the kind of, the long context of imperialism by Russia in Ukraine. Incidentally, I had on the Scottish left is kind of where I've been for a long time. And I had, several friends take this line where they have never spoken to Ukrainians, they don't go to Ukraine, but they sit very comfortably and talk about puppets, proxies, CIA, propping up. It's absolutely exhausting, and it is propaganda itself. And I really recommend talking to Ukrainians, particularly those on the left, like in Suspilna magazine. There's a strong Ukrainian left, and they can explain to you why this stuff is absolute nonsense. My question for Trevor, though, about the Soviet legacy, as more and more research and dissemination is coming out of the reality of what the Soviet Empire was, particularly for peoples within Russia's rule, the oppression against different ethnicities within that landmass under the Soviet rule, the forced relocation, you all know the thing. Is that idea of the Soviet Union as an empire, which also oppressed, gaining any ground, or does it not really fit the narrative?
Thank you. And I think that's one of the reasons why we invited Olena to speak tonight, so that she could also give a perspective from a Ukrainian perspective on the war. Trevor, do you want to answer? Do you want to?
Yes, please.
I think
yes.
If you could just relate to all the interventions and questions, so that we can, absorb as much as possible before you leave. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
And you're still not visible, just to let you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure why now I'm not visible because, oh, there we are. Yeah, so yeah, so basically John is correct, because when we look at the history of the Soviet Union and its support for national liberation movements, although it was most appreciated, because remember, you know, countries like South Africa could get guns, could get comrades trained in various skills. I think money also was provided. But under Stalinism, which was a more or less nationalistic or inward-looking form of, I don't know, state capitalism, if you like, or a degenerated worker state, all the calculations were done to favor the Soviet bureaucracy, you know, the power of Stalin, the power of the nomenclatura, those who are in power. So you'd find that certain positions were taken which did not favor the national liberation movement concerned or the Communist Party concerned, but it would favor certain interests in the Soviet bureaucracy. So we know that. And then John talked about some contradictions where maybe racism or xenophobia, people experience that. Yes, it did happen, as far as I know, and most of it was swept under the carpet. But of course, with us, we had the ANC, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party in exile. They were waging a struggle from outside, but they did not always do the right things. For example, there was a mutiny which was as a result of their own mistakes as a leadership, which they suppressed by, you know, shooting people dead. There were many problems, including gender-based violence against guerrillas, women guerrillas. There was also stealing of money, smuggling. So the ANC and the Communist Party, they had a lot to hide from us or from their members or from the masses. So some of the things they hid, of course, was the role of the Soviet Union in relation to our struggle, in relation to how it treated guerrillas or comrades in the Soviet Union. So that's part of that. There has not been a serious interrogation of this history, partly because of the weakness of the left in South Africa, partly because the ANC government is making creating so many problems for the working class. You know, no one is paying attention to history. People are just trying to survive, trying to find a solution. You know, we've got rolling blackouts, we've got rising poverty, unemployment, gender-based violence, etc., etc. So, but I think it's important to revisit the role of the Soviet Union in relation not only to South Africa, but to other national liberation struggles. I do believe that although some good was done, but a lot of damage was done, which will take decades to actually sort out. And in the spirit of the chair, I also agree with Comrade Alex Kalinikos about the link between Palestine and the Ukraine struggles in terms of geopolitics, the inter-imperialist, rivalry. So our position here in South Africa, although some comrades in the South African Communist Party won't agree, we also have comrades who were South African Communist Party, but who formed a new party, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, closely associated with the biggest union, the Metal Workers, and NUMSA, Metal Workers Union of South Africa. They are also falling into this camp where we support China. We must support China China is not an imperialist country, it's a liberator. We must support Putin. Putin is a strong man. We need strong states to fight the West. But doing that is based on dividing the world into East and West, and then saying everything on East is right, is correct, and everything West is not good. So that logic is, it stops debate, and it makes people to accuse each other. It means you're an American stooge, spy, or whatever, if you question support for the Russian invasion. In a nutshell, there are too many wrong things happening in South Africa for us to think clearly, but it's all the more reason that we should think clearly. It's a dialectical thing, but certainly we have a struggle here to win comrades to a pro-working class, pro-socialist position which is not tainted by nationalism, even if we support the right of nations to self-determination, but the priority is the class question. And in the various ways it's linked with gender, race, and other struggles. So thank you, comrades, for having me. I think I'll have to leave now and forward with socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor, and see you soon, and definitely up with socialism and internationalism.
Thank you.
Okay, there was another question for you, but maybe I'll put you in touch. But I think maybe John wants to ask to the other two speakers. So there are two hands up from Patrick and of course Lawrence, without which a seminar in contemporary Marxist theory wouldn't be a seminar in contemporary Marxist theory. So that's very reassuring. But there were other questions, especially for Olena, but I think also Patrick links up with what Chelsea was saying. So Sergey Stablev, are you there? Do you want to ask your question, or shall I read it out? It's a question for Olena, which was asked up in the chat.
Yeah, I can phrase it.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for their presentations. Yeah, I'm just curious to understand. Olena has mentioned as far as I understand, a financial aid package who has been tied to a condition for the Ukrainian government to roll back further the social expenditure, welfare expenditure, and restructure the way it is assigned, moving from based on status to means based. Yeah, I'm curious how Olena understands the motivating logic behind this in Ukrainian case specifically. How should we think about such conditions?
Thank you, Sergey. And then Ian actually asked a follow-up question on your question, which was basically, Ian, are you there? You were very active in the chat, so we would like to see you if you're still around. Otherwise, I will read out your question. Okay, sorry, we don't have that much time. So Ian was adding to Sergey's question, say, what do you think, Olena, of the planned reconstruction of Ukraine? Like, for example, BlackRock contracts and also schemes to make Ukraine the first fully digitalized economy. Okay, then Patrick, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask Olena about Vince Bevan's attempt to tie together the U.S. foreign policy in a range of interventions that included military and economic, because his thesis is that there's this modernization theory that ties the assassinations and the coups and the military, small wars of aggression in the Cold War from Indonesia, which he highlights especially, but across Latin America and Africa and other parts of Asia, And my question is, how does that apply to Eastern Europe? Because in the Eastern Europe context after 1989, when the Soviet Union became its own kind of strange capitalist mix and imperialist mix, and the US hadn't traditionally been able to pursue what Vince Bevins calls the Jakarta method, there was also this really interesting struggle to finance Ukraine's debt, and the Eurozone funders, the ECB and Angela Merkel and the German bank and the Troika just refused to either agree to finance the Ukraine debt or to allow Ukraine to have access to the European Union. And then the IMF stepped in and since 2000 has just imposed incredible austerity on Ukraine. And I just wondered if she could comment on how Vince Bevins' approach appears to her as an account of the post-World War II Cold War US strategy, and then how it applies differently in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine in particular after 1989.
Thank you. Lawrence?
Can I make an observation firstly that no progressive government should be normalizing relationship with the US at the moment. 4 governments have actually, withdrawn with America. 4 governments have withdrawn, ambassadorial relationships with Israel. So China is normalizing relationship with the US. Secondly, I want to say that 2 Marxist seminars ago, we had Olena here with her speaker from Palestine. Yeah, if people remember. Then the speaker from Palestine was talking about the normalization of situation in Palestine and Israel. And I didn't quite understand what it meant. Until recently, when you understand the normalization, it meant normalizing Israeli apartheid. Because the whole thing about South Africa as a liberation movement was that it smashed South African apartheid. But what normalization means is to normalize Israeli apartheid. And we have to understand in the international dimension how significant our Aqsa flood did to stop the normalization. In other words, all the Arab governments, you cannot go ahead and normalize things with Israel. And also it means, America. So it seems to me, this is the potential for, what it means for all of us. One thing to smash apartheid, which has such important ramifications, and normalizing Israeli apartheid. And then my final question, in terms of, a broader liberation for international movement, we were all anti-apartheid then. And then finally, I wanted to ask Olena, how do Ukrainians yourself feel? Because, you have a history when Biden says we link Israel with Ukraine. How do they feel in terms of this linking?
Thank you. I think I will let John and Ian ask a question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the interventions. It was great, right, from each speaker. I guess this is to Chelsea, but Olena can answer as well if she wants. And Trevor, it was for Trevor as well, but he's gone. I wanted to, Chelsea, in your talk, you kind of went over the kind of idea of world making, which kind of punctuated anti-colonial movements, right? So moving from anti-colonial nationalism to creating of kind of transnational or international institutions. And then in Trevor's talk, there was a sort of dichotomy between those things where Trevor was saying, well, the BRICS is really just a kind of neoliberalism with southern characteristics. And in a sense, you have to go back to the masses. But I wondered, Chelsea, whether you thought that what the new agenda of world making is in the global south and how this is pinned into the Ukrainian conflict. To give you an example, in Biden's recent call for foreign aid spending, which is basically military spending of 106 billion, large amount of that was earmarked for Ukraine, but also Israel. There is a 4 billion entry into, and it's actually labeled as countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific, right? So you see the merging between imperialist war and also imperialist rivalry in these budgets, right? And so in a sense, the world making thing can't just be dismissed like as just empty rhetoric, because it is actually there. To put this into context, over the last decade, this 4 billion, right, for this, over the last decade, China spent $1 trillion on infrastructure in the global south, right? 6 times as much in that period was spent on the war on terror. So in a sense, it's not a sense of just inter-imperialist rivalry. It's also about how these imperialist rivals are actually spending their money, right? One has been spending it on infrastructure, and it seems that the democracy project has been spending it on guns and butter, right? Guns rather than butter. And so in a sense, how does world making then and Ukraine, well, the merging of these things then kind of transpire now? What is the sense of world making at the international level, if that makes sense?
Thank you, John. Ian, have you chosen your question? And does anyone else, including, I saw there was some women who were actually quite active in the chat, and I just was wondering whether they would like for example, Anastasia would like to intervene before we ask Olena and Chelsea to reply. Okay, Ian, I give you 2 minutes, yeah? So just one question.
Thank you. Thanks for reading out that question that I added on about the kind of dystopic turbo-capitalist plans for the reconstruction. And I think Lawrence asked a very good question. I was just getting around to ask in the chat about how Biden's trying to bundle together all the different proxy wars that are going on, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, even Taiwan that hasn't started yet. I'd just like to ask about self-determination across the board. I certainly think Russian troops out, stop the war coalition demand on their demos is appropriate to West Ukraine going into Kiev. There's definitely a mood, I think, in most of Ukraine for them not to be there, but I do wonder about the Donbass and in the need for a democratic peace where all Ukrainians can feel that they're not being held against their will in a state that they don't want to be in a state structure that they don't want to be in. The Minsk agreements did talk about federalism, but have been undermined by people like Merkel, even saying that this was just a ruse to buy time to rearm. And there's a big difference between a war of liberation and a war to recapture parts of your country that don't want to be recaptured, as we saw recently in another post-Soviet conflict that ended in the worst possible way in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I just wonder what the comrades think about that, about Donbass and Crimea and the right to hold referendums, which I'd accept that the referendums that were held within like 5 days were not the international gold standard, but I'm not quite as convinced that, especially after everything that's happened, if it was held to the gold standard, you'd get a hugely different and more pro-Kyiv result. And so how to deal with that aspect of the problem of liberation in Ukraine as well, which to an extent maybe does show it being more like the Israeli side of the current conflict. Thanks.
Thank you. And a last question, unless there is something that comes up later, would be actually Anastasia.
Lucia, if I can intervene later, maybe following up on Olena's answers and Chelsea's answers, I think I have a couple of reflections to share regarding Vincent's question, and then I might offer maybe some perspective also concerning Ian's question, but concerning
I think if you could go ahead now, because I'm not sure we will have another round. I mean, I was just opening the possibility, but I think probably now would be better. Sorry.
No, of course. So I understand that the question was directed to Olena, and I'm kind of preempting her in that sense, but being concerning what it feels like for Ukrainians, and I'm thinking primarily of Ukrainians on the left, I believe, and I allow myself to speak partly perhaps on their behalf, or as one of them at least. It is quite terrifying to hear this about this coupling of Ukraine and Israel, and to represent those and the way those struggles are represented as somehow similar or equal by the West to further their imperialist ambitions is truly horrifying to me. And I think it is particularly horrifying because the Palestinian people have, from the outset of the invasion, actually been supporting Ukrainians and been calling for Ukrainians' rights to self-determination. So how this mental gymnastics really works with trying to portray an apartheid state and a state that wasn't imperial domination of another state as somehow equal is, and I feel a profound sense of shame for that government and so for those officials. I guess what I can say is that there are certainly strong Ukrainian voices in support of Palestine as well. And I want comrades to know that when it comes to the Donbas and the Crimea, as I said in the comments already, so I myself come from a small town of Rovinky, that's 50 kilometers from Russian border, my experience, of course, I cannot again talk for the entire region. My experience has been that there haven't been strong calls for referendum, for instance, before May 2014. So when Russia had already kind of initiated the propaganda campaign in those two regions, and when some troops have already entered Ukraine. That wasn't really something that people discussed up to 2014. That wasn't something that was really articulated as a political demand. There were questions surrounding the economic redistribution and distribution of wealth in the country. There were the questions that manipulated the language issue, and every election, the questions surrounding the use of Russian in public domain were used by the pro-Russian parties to kind of further their agenda. But my experience of what was happening and what is happening is that the pro-independence or separatist movement does not really have a genuine grassroots base. So a lot of what we see concerning a lot of commentary about Minsk agreements and so on and so forth really misconstrues the issue as far as I'm concerned. But certainly, again, based on kind of personal experience, I can agree with the fact that if we had some kind of fair opinion poll, referendum, whatever now, or transparent one, probably the results would be very strongly pro-Russian, but that is also due to the media landscape that existed in the Donbas since 2014, and the way the Donbas was completely discommunicated, or the communications were cut by the occupying administration, and where Ukrainians in the occupied territories didn't really have access to Ukrainian media and so on and so forth. So the propaganda has definitely been doing its work in 10 years. So what we see today is quite different from what we would see 10 years ago if we had the possibility to actually ask the will of the people. And from a very kind of sorry, I'll stop there.
Sorry, Anastasia. Doug, do you want to say something in 1 minute, because you were very active in the chat? Do you want to say 1 minute thing, and then we let Olena and Chelsea? Okay. No, thank you. Okay, no, never mind. Okay, Olena, do you want to go first? I think I will give 10 minutes each because there is a lot on the plate, and therefore I hope that's enough. And I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left. Okay, Olena, you go first. Is that okay? Or yeah, I think it's okay.
Up to you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that Anastasia answered like what I would have answered about Donbass. I think that we need to. I'm also from Donbass. I think that we need to look at the political economic demands that were going on around 2013, 2014, and also the way in which you know, I've been talking about primitive accumulation and in the post-Soviet countries, but in Ukraine, the way in which industrial capital was kind of set up between two different rival towns, you know, like cities within Ukraine. So this is Dnipropetrovsk and you know, Donetsk, for instance. And so there's like just so much to say about how this was also kind of in between, you could say, kleptocrats, or between these like this new capitalist class or rivalry in terms of getting to access to political power also. So what happens with, say, the really industrial towns in Donbass around 2013, and then after the last election, the so-called Orange Revolution, and so on. Like that's very important from a political economy perspective to understand then how we get to 2014 and people's demands even now, when even in the occupied, like separatist, so-called separatist republics, the people's demands are very much still based on material like interests and demands that are regional, you know, and that are very post-Soviet and Soviet nostalgic, because Donbass was such an important industrial you know, hub, right, for the Soviet Union. So these are very important questions to consider when we answer this, like, oh, like what happened there, you know? Is it all just caused by Russian propaganda? Yeah, like sure, like there's production of it big time and they're very good at it, you know, but at the same time, there are these political economic explanations and people's demands for better life and so on and so on. And that were couched also in the Soviet nostalgic terms, which, you know, we should study more actually. So, but I generally agree with Anastasia, like her comment about this. Now, in terms of the US empire and Ukraine plus Israel plus Taiwan, you know, like all together, I was laughing and I call this intersectional imperialism, you know. I think this is a good term because it kind of encompasses the way in which things, you know, when they tell us, oh, Ukraine is like Israel, why don't we believe them? Like we say, no, Ukraine is Palestine, right? But in terms of foreign policy, in terms of like, that's how it's treated, right? And where the money is going and so on, as John, you know, so eloquently put. So I think we should take it seriously when they say this to us. And the Ukrainian working class should take that seriously and say, wait a minute, no, actually, no, we are, you know, no, we don't want Israel here. Like that wouldn't be good for us, right? Like this is important. So we should believe them when they say that. And then Sergey, your question about and then Ian's question attached about the reconstruction of Ukraine, sort of one question. I'll try to address that. I'm actually in Warsaw right now in Poland, and there's going to be a conference called Rebuild Ukraine, where these different industries, these different capitalists are coming together at this huge conference to pitch the Ukrainian government to reconstruct, to use them to reconstruct Ukraine. The entrance fees, the lowest one is 300 euros, and the mid-ground entrance fee just for participants is 500 euros. And then it goes up from there. So this is kind of our little a little coin in the, you know, like 2 cents into the reconstruction of Ukraine. So this is very funny, but yeah, it's a totally a process of dispossession. Involving, you know, somebody said Ukraine will be the first digitalized country. Well, yeah, we're going to be digitalized, but we will be hungry. You know, it's that kind of situation. And the people who are going to suffer from this are, working class people, especially women, especially the elderly, especially children in Ukraine. So that's what's going to happen. And what is the motivation in terms of privatizing? And so, I've written about this a little bit before, but I can tell you this reconstruction plan. I mean, it's craziness because let me see, out of 15 things that they want to do, like this recovery and reconstruction plan, healthcare and education and social policy are like the 13th and the 14th on the list. It's that kind of thing. Yeah. So strong European Ukraine is a magnet for international investment. This is what drives this reconstruction plan. It really is. It's like Chile in the sense of like becoming a new laboratory in neoliberal innovation. This is what we're seeing in front of our eyes, and I wonder how this model will be taken elsewhere, So they're developing telemedicine and IT infrastructure for psychological rehabilitation, but privatizing social, benefits, privatizing childcare. It's very fascinating. Will be already a fascinating process. And of course, gender mainstreaming is an important part, officially of this reconstruction plan, but the gender mainstreaming is about, having more women in the army and so on. So yeah, Kyle Bailey's question, I can talk more about the reconstruction plan, and I hope to write something about after attending this crazy conference. Kyle Bailey's question is very, very, very good, and I agree with his analysis that, yeah, there's something that's going on here where self-determination is kind of instrumentalized, and in terms of almost civilizational logic of the West, self-determination is now a Western thing. All of a sudden, somehow self-determination itself has become kind of washed of European sins of imperialism, continuously, where everything is just flipped on its head, like, oh, it's Israel's self-determination or something. So it's just disgusting, but it's not surprising. And yet I think the war in Ukraine has brought up these I don't know, I call this modernization theory to some extent, but has brought up these new tendencies, these bold claims, and there is no deterrent. Officially, there is such a split between what, we might call civil society, though I don't like this term, but civil society, and all these protests, like tens, hundreds of thousands of people are on the street for Palestine. And yet at the level of official politics, it's, very much just few Latin American countries. But outside of that, it's very much support of Israel, including Ukraine, which is shameful, right? So there's no deterrent that is serious to prevent this, at the institutional, official, political, almost level, such a gap in representation in some ways. Yeah, what else was I going to answer? The question, the prize for the best question, Patrick, goes to you, because I really would need a minute or a couple of hours to answer this question. My first initial reaction is, you write, quote, Americans failed to understand what nationalism was in the context of emerging countries and its difference from communism. It was not about race or religion or even borders. It was built in opposition to centuries of colonialism. Well, I think, as Trevor has already said before, self-determination movement, anti-colonial movements were very much linked to communist or like socialist movements. And I think that's where Americans failed to understand, or understood very well and broke that up. I don't know, one or the other. But I would need more time to really answer this question.
Maybe, Olena, if you have, I give you 2 more minutes. The question of solidarity, right? which I think was one of the questions initially. So of Ukrainian agency, the fact, that your presentation, I think, portrays the situation in which, the Ukrainian government is very much embedded within this web of Western interests. But what does it mean in terms of solidarity towards Ukrainian and Ukrainian agency? I think probably this is one of the questions that came up more in the chat.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we need to separate, and this is what's actually missing from sometimes on the left as well, but certainly mainstream media and, academic work, is that there is a conflation between the official line of the Zelensky government and kind of the sort of liberal kind of elites and working class Ukrainians. I think that they shouldn't be conflated. I think actually they should be separated. And we should understand that the Ukrainians, while they are fighting Russian imperialism, right, that they are also in opposition to their capitalist state, really, like objectively speaking, they are, as workers, because this capitalist state is dispossessing them in real time while they're also dying. So this is an important distinction we really, really need to make. And I think that, I mean, there's so much mutual aid that has been growing and that sort of thing. But to be honest, in terms of prospects, so, our solidarity should be with Ukrainian workers, with Ukrainian people, with Ukrainian women who are suffering and dying. But in terms of a prospect for socialist transformation, if that's the question, like right now, it's a very sad picture. I don't see it. And I think that there is quite a bit of, it's devastating. I think we also don't hear the extent of the diversity of Ukrainian society. I think it's quite plural and diverse. So we really get, quite a lot of, again, this sort of not, Zelensky government, very much a liberal, like maybe even position, some aspiring students who want to, be so European and so on. But we really don't hear much from Donbass, right? Really, very little analysis, very little interviews. Also, very much, if we want to, even if I want to write something about it, it will be 100 times contested, So under these conditions, it's very difficult to get a sense of what's going on, right? So I think this part about diversity is very important to consider, that Ukraine isn't one thing, this kind of one party line about Europe and about what self-determination means. I think it might mean very different things for different people. And again, we need to look at the political economy of these things, right? As I said, like from the beginning, also being from Donbass, like being from, places like Mariupol, my goodness, these things will be contested for a while to really understand. One thing that I will add is what's very interesting and fascinating in terms of Lugansk and Donetsk in particular is the way in which the Russian state institutions are, now with citizenship and passportization are spreading into these regions, and how social policies are also are being extended, like maternity capital benefit in Russia. It's being extended to Donbass now. And the way in which people make claims on the Russian state and on the promises of Russian citizenship is quite fascinating from like a political economy, from a social reproduction perspective, where people say something like, well, you promised us pensions at the level of citizens like in St. Petersburg. If we have all become Russian citizens, then why don't you deliver on these things? These are interesting developments. Don't know what this will mean long term, but certainly we need to take seriously, again, the social reproduction kind of side of the here. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olena, and solidarity. Chelsea, sorry about the delay, but you can have more time. I mean, I see that even if we are slightly late, almost everyone is staying. So it looks like people are really interested in the discussion.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
I start with a question by John about New World Order or world making. I think the Russian invasion, I think behind the scenes, most governments and even peoples, they don't really endorse the invasion as a measure to solve, the disputes between Ukraine and Russia, externally and internally. But once the West imposed like unilateral sanctions against Russia, confiscated, financial assets of the Russian elite to be used to, rebuild Ukraine. I think not just the elite in the global South, but also ordinary people became terrified because, for example, from Vietnam, like after the US invasion of Vietnam, it endured over 20 years of international sanctions. And until this day, I mean, victims of, Agent Orange, the chemical warfare that took place across southern Vietnam between 1961 and 71. It affected millions of people across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And until this very date, they are not officially recognized by the US government. So later in 2022, when there was a UN General Assembly resolution which was proposed by various Western UN member states about, agreeing that, Russia has to compensate Ukraine for the war damages. I mean, the vast majorities of countries, not just the large populated countries in the global South, but even many small populated countries in the global South, they abstained because I hear this also among, former Ukrainian, foreign ministers and other levels of officials saying that, the West needs to pressure Russia to compensate Ukraine. But from the, global South perspective, notwithstanding diversities within the global South, it rings hollow because what should be pushed forward is, an international system of compliance so that, all sorts of war crimes and wars must be compensated for, not just in the case of Ukraine. And secondly, about new world making, again, I emphasized from the very beginning that within major countries in the global South, there are distinct political and economic visions for what this emerging new world order is going to look like. There are many different kinds of global Souths. For example, when it comes to, or before that, I agree largely with what Trevor said about, new liberalism with Southern characteristics. I mean, sometimes the distinction between West and the East, North and South can be superficial because sometimes, me personally, I feel that, developmentalist competitions, hyper-capitalism, civilizational nationalism that is rife across the global South nowadays as well is at the much serious and dangerous levels than I see in the West sometimes. So there are more commonalities actually than differences in those aspects. And for example, when it comes to, reform of the UN system, for example, the expansion of permanent members in the UN Security Councils to, include more voices from the global South. I mean, the differences are not really between the West and the East, it's between India and China. In the 1950s, India wholeheartedly supported for China's seat in the UN Security Council. Nowadays, it's China that is opposed to India's inclusion. And besides the border disputes, and there are different visions for, a global South-oriented world order. You see how overall, I mean, the desires across the global South, broadly speaking, for a different world order is still reactive rather than, taking the initiative to propose actual progressive politics and economic systems. It's still more about, this modernization theory mentality about catching up with the prosperous West, cultivating good diplomatic relations with certain high-tech developed countries. Lauren's point about the normalization of Israel's apartheid, for example. I think over the years, countries as China and Vietnam with historical socialist legacies, even themselves have kind of, practically speaking, given up on the Palestine question. I mean, formally at the UN every year, they say that they support a two-state solution, Palestinian self-determination and statehood, but behind the scenes, I mean, just this summer, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, they became the second country in Southeast Asia after Singapore to sign a free trade agreement with Israel. During the Israeli-Palestinian escalations now, it's been voting in favor of a ceasefire at the UN General Assembly, but in all, it's very quiet. So you see, within the global South, there are vast political differences because the dominant logic among governments these days is the logic of seeking national security and meeting developmentalist goals, which are to some extent justified, but it's very constraining in terms of proposing a more progressive politics beyond the current world order. And also, I want to contribute about the Ukraine-Israel linkage that's being emphasized in the West. I think it's the past 4 weeks, I've never in my career seen such a popular outrage across the Middle East, the Islamic world, and in many other countries in the global South against this linkage, because it's so brazen, even by the basic standards of international laws, in which a territorially occupying state is being equated with a territorially occupied state. And the worst of all is that when they make these linkages, they know what they're doing. There's no contradictions for them. And I think this momentum is, I think at the grassroots level or among ordinary people, I'm not speaking about the governments, but especially in the Middle East, it could constitute a kind of a 1968 moment. Like, because, in 1968 protests all over the world, it happened during the Vietnam War. And it was, a moment for, all sorts of, calls for social revolutions, rebellions, and change of the world. And I think across, especially in the Middle East now, there are people who are so enraged by, the contrasting responses by the West to these two twin wars, to a point where I think even their own governments are concerned that they might get overthrown if they're not responsive enough to the fact that the Palestine question has been so ignored for the past 10 years. And my impression when speaking with Ukrainian counterparts, I hope to be able to speak more with ordinary people or those at the grassroots in Ukrainian society, but my experience is that the Palestine question is a very difficult question to discuss in Ukraine. Somehow, once you raise, genuine commonalities between Palestine and Ukraine from an international legal perspective, it easily triggers anger among large segments in Ukrainian society and policymakers, scholars, diplomats. And I mean, the magazine Commons, I think a few days ago, when they released a solidarity letter for the Palestinians, I mean, the website got instantly attacked for several days, which has never happened before to this website. And you can read all the social media comments. Now, whenever they post anything about Palestine, the vast majority of the comments are extremely dehumanizing towards the Palestinians. It's a spectacle to witness how throughout the past 2 years we have seen the Russian calls for denazifying Ukrainians, how all Ukrainians are inherently Nazis because they're anti-Russian, etc., etc. And then you see this stigmatizations being reproduced in the Palestinian context, even by many Ukrainians as well. And it's depressing to watch. But I don't know. I think the what's happening in Gaza at the moment and in the West Bank, it's another awakening moment for large parts of the global South. Although, like I said in the beginning, it's complicated when, you know, major countries as India has throughoutly transformed itself and departed from its former non-alignment and sympathetic position to Palestine towards something that's more aligned with the West, and which complicates, you know, the power of the collective global South to, you know, stand up for genuine justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you so much also, Olena, and everyone. I think it was a very, I hope, productive discussion. I see John has posted something about our future events. Our next seminar will be on the 8th of December. Will it be on the 8th of December or actually on the 6th of December, which is Wednesday, 6th of December, with Arun Kundnani about his latest book, What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. So this will also be online. And I have actually saved the chat. So I don't know if there are, why did you ask, Alex? Because of references and is there
I
anything?
suggested, I mean, it's a very interesting chat. Lots of really rich points are made in the discussion. So I just wondered whether it could be saved.
I have saved it.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
But I'm not sure whether I can share it with all the mailing lists. So, but if anyone has any query or if there is anything relevant, any link, we can share it to the mailing list in future weeks. Okay. So, well, I think it was refreshing and invigorating to have these debates about, you know, even though the situation is not very positive, as we know, I think that having these productive discussions and, you know, centering on the needs of workers and the future humanity is the right approach to address these questions. And I hope this was also a productive, insightful seminar for you. So stay connected with us. I hope to see you again and have a nice evening. And thanks again, Olena and Chelsea. It was really, really interesting. And I think the three perspectives really linked up well together. So thanks again. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for